Thank you all for joining us here this evening in our brand new digs here at Badger & Co. I really hope you had an easier time finding the place than I did. But what a gorgeous venue, and we're so excited to see some familiar and some new faces out here tonight. For those who don't know, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director of the Australia Institute. We're a Canberra-based think tank, and delighted to be a Canberra-based think tank when it comes to the budget, or as it's known in our office, Economist Christmas. You'll have to forgive my voice this evening. I'm hoping that these three will be able to take over the conversation largely for me. But tonight I am delighted that we're joined by an expert panel of economists. We've got Richard Dennis, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, Matt Grudnoff, our Senior Economist, and joining us for the first time, Troy Henderson, an economist for the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work. Give them a round of applause. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope you have a great night. Budget time is one of our favourite times of year. And so without further ado, Matt, I might kick off with you because you're in the budget lockup. What's your verdict on the budget?
Well, it was an election budget, but one with a twist. But to begin with, they say you should start with a joke. So 3 economists walk into a bar to talk about the budget, and hundreds of people show up. How Canberra is that? And the reason that excites me is because I get really excited at budget time. It is my favourite time of year, and usually my family and friends look at me perplexly. So it's nice to see other people who are actually interested in the budget. And the reason I think the budget is so exciting is because politicians basically talk nonsense most of the year round, but it's the one time of year when you get to actually find out what their real priorities are. They can tell you that this particular issue is really important or that project is really important, but if they don't put any money into it, you know that they're just telling you nonsense. But if they actually put money into it, well, that's actually their priority. So budgets are about finding out politicians' priorities, or as the government's been continuously telling us, it's also about values. And the government's very keen to tell us that its values are lower taxes, but what they're less keen to talk to you about is that they want to maintain a surplus. So the only way you get lower taxes with a surplus is if you have less spending. And they're not so keen to talk to you about the fact that every time you hear Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, say, we believe in lower taxes, every time you hear the Prime Minister say, we like lower taxes, every time you hear any Liberal Party politician say, we like lower taxes, they're also telling you that they want less spending. They want less spending on health, they want less spending on education, they want less spending on aged care, they want less spending on all the sort of things that people demand. You can't have a surplus budget, lower taxes and more spending. That's the magic pudding that just can't exist. So the budget was quite interesting. I've got just a couple of things I'll go through. I mean, the budget is a massive document and there's lots and lots of things in there. But probably the main thing that they're talking about is the tax cuts. And basically these tax cuts are a building on previous tax cuts that they announced last year. And really they're a lot of light and movement about low and middle income tax offsets in the short term. And what they talk less about in the long term is a flattening of the tax scales. Now, flattening of the tax scales means less progressive taxation. If you flatten tax scales, if you put everybody or most people on one tax rate, then you're effectively reducing the progressive nature of the tax system. What does that mean? Well, progressive taxes is what's underpinned income tax since World War II. And it just means that the more you earn, the more income you have, the higher proportion of tax you pay. So as you flatten them out, what it simply means is that those on higher incomes pay less as a proportion of their tax, and those on low incomes will inevitably pay more. And while they're keen to give you something early on in the form of a tax offset, they're less keen to talk about those flattening of tax rates, which happen sort of 6-7 years' time. And we actually did an analysis of those tax cuts once they're fully implemented, and we found that a third of them go to the top 10% of income earners, more than half of them, 54%, go to the top 20% of income earners, and just 3% of those tax cuts go to the bottom 20% of income earners. So they really are targeted at high income earners. And not just high income earners, they're also targeted at men. We did a gender split for them, and we found that when they're fully implemented, for every dollar that women get in tax cuts, men will get $2. So for every dollar that females get in the tax cut, men will get $2 worth. And that's mainly because men predominantly dominate the high income area. So there's more men earning higher incomes. Also, the government has been talking a lot about fiscal rules, which is certainly words that bore everybody to death, but they've been talking about this thing they call the 23.9% cap on spending, and basically it's designed to stop future governments from allowing tax revenue to grow and therefore be able to spend more money. What's fascinating about them is they're non-binding, so the Liberal Party spent a lot of time saying Labor should follow these rules that we've invented, but also they actually had 3 rules, and they broke 2 of them in this budget. So even those rules, the government aren't keen to follow.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. So the rules I make are the rules I break. So it basically means that they're not particularly serious about this, and they're quite happy to break those rules. But I think I'll stop there, and I'll hand over to Richard.
Yeah, what did you think of the budget, Richard?
Well, I didn't go to lockup. I've had 20 years of lockups, and I was locked out this year. And it's a good thing. I actually think, by the way, before I talk about the budget, the content, I want to talk about the process. In America, they have the State of the Union address as their big How's Our Nation Travelling annual speech. And in Australia, we have the state of our finances. We talk about our budget. And it's the one prime time televised speech that the government makes, and it's not even made by the Prime Minister. So budgets are very important. As Matt said, budgets are one of the main ways in which a government can express its values and its priorities. Who gets more, who gets less. But the fact that talking about our finances, and nearly every journalist falls into the trap of saying the nation's health or the nation's wealth. This is the Commonwealth government. It's the taxes that we pay. It's the money that they spend on us. But whether there's a budget deficit of $7 billion or a budget surplus of $7 billion, that's rounding error in the national economy. And to suggest that the health of our economy, the health of our society can be captured in that way is alarming. And Australia is one of the few countries in the world that has a budget lockup. Have you ever thought about what the lockup is all about? It's about locking senior journalists not up, it's locking them away. They're literally locked in a room with only one story to write about all day long, the budget. And guess what happens when you lock hundreds of journalists in a room with no access to the outside world and only one story to write about? They write about it. So we talk endlessly about it for days, and we rightly, I think, dissect it. But the national media, there's no reason the budget couldn't be released at 10 o'clock in the morning. There's no reason that budget documents couldn't all go up online and we could all read them all day, and journalists could call anyone they want and talk about it. But it's this staged, managed process, and I think we need to kind of reflect on why for so many years now we've let politicians tell us that the state of the budget is in some way the state of our country. Nothing could be further from the proof. In terms of the contents of the budget, well, I agree with most of what Matt said. I just want to emphasise that. Let's be clear. Australia isn't living up to its international obligations on foreign aid. We are one of the richest countries in the world, living at the richest point in world history. We can afford tax cuts for high-income earners like me, and we can't afford to spend more on international aid and development. I don't know why you're clapping. I think now would be a time to boo or hiss. So what we have to look at in terms of $150 billion worth of tax cuts, how many years is that over, Matt? I can't remember. I think that's over 10.
10, yeah.
Yeah, right. So
It's 300 billion.
yeah, so we've had $300 billion worth of tax cuts announced in the last 2 years. Well, let's remember that in 2013 we had a budget emergency. In 2013 we had a budget emergency and Tony Abbott said the number one thing we had to do was pay down debt. We've doubled the public debt. I am unconcerned about this, by the way, but we've doubled it. So if the crisis was the level of debt in 2013, the crisis is twice as big now. And then after announcing that we'll have one small budget surplus in the coming year, right, we haven't had a budget surplus yet, we're projecting one for this year, apparently doubling the debt is no longer a problem because we're going to have one surplus. So if that was a household, imagine you had $20,000 on your credit card in 2013, you've now got $40,000 on your credit card. Is that a problem? No. Why not? Oh, I made my first repayment. I've started to pay some back, so everything's all right. Now, again, Australia is a low tax, low debt country. We never were in a budget emergency, but we were lied to in 2013. Sensible people were scared into thinking we had a problem, but the people that scared us into thinking we had a problem treated that problem with contempt, and now even though they've doubled the amount of debt that they were allegedly worried about, they've announced $300 billion worth of tax cuts. I call this the right-wing ratchet. Whenever times are good, cut taxes for your friends. Whenever times are bad, cut spending on your enemies. Okay, Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. We use tax cuts to cause budget deficits in the future, because when the budget deficit comes along, it's a great excuse to cut spending on health, cut spending on education, you name it. So, a little bit of context, the budget is important, but we've kind of in Australia turned it into this enormous thing, but you know, our media don't even go back and really give us 5 years of economic history to place everything you heard last night into context, which of course makes a mockery of it.
And Troy, the Centre for Future Work obviously looks at things from the workers' perspective. Was this a good budget for workers?
In an abstract sense, you could say it was, as it has been for the last few budgets, but not in any practical sense. And like Matt, I'd like to start with a joke, a hilarious joke about you have an economist, an engineer and a physicist on a desert island, and they've got to open a can of baked beans. And the physicist works out the right way to shine the sunlight on the can to explode the can and get baked beans in his face or her face. And the engineer throws it off the rock at the right angle to open it, and the economist just assumes that they have a can opener. And this is one of the fundamental issues we face repeatedly around the issue of economic forecasts, and particularly if we're looking at something like wages. Over the last 5 or 6 budgets, we miraculously see every single time, despite 5 years of wage stagnation since the end of the second mining boom, we see that in the second, third, fourth years of the four-year budget period, that wage growth remarkably returns to trend, to normal, healthy wages growth of 3.25 to 3.5%. And that's why our director, Jim Stanford, called our little budget briefing last night, whoops, I did it again. Because Treasury still forecasts, the government, Treasury, Department of Finance, whoever is putting this together, still forecasts that return to traditional levels that we would think of as healthy wages growth, where the reality at the moment in Australia is anything but. So that's probably the key point I'd make. And the thing that we like to emphasise is that pay increases for all workers, for millions of workers, 3.5% year-on-year cumulative pay increases they beat tax cuts any day of the week. And those are the types of policy levers we should be leaning on in Australia at the moment if we want to have greater shared prosperity over the next 5 or 10 years than we've had over the preceding 5.
So basically, we've had a massive budget of tax cuts, but you're saying if you're a worker who hasn't had a pay rise in ages, a better pay rise would actually be better for you.
Absolutely right. A pay rise beats tax cuts. And the thing about the tax cuts is, as Matt was talking about, the really big flattening of the tax scale takes place in 3, 4, 5 years' time down the track. This is exactly what they did last time. Projecting this kind of dream of some conservatives, some on the right, of this wonderful flat tax paradise where everyone will be freed from the burden of excessive taxation. But in the short term, we're seeing modest tax cuts and nothing much to lead you to believe that we're going to get a sudden uptick in wages growth. Particularly when you also look at the budget projections, and unemployment is meant to just stay at 5% for the next 4 or 5 years. So, and if lower unemployment is meant to be the main driver because of tighter labour market conditions, of higher wages growth, how are these two things meant to intersect?
Richard, tell me about flattening our progressive tax system, because I feel like we talk about it, but maybe people don't necessarily understand the implications of that.
We're so in sync. I was about to say, Eb, let me say something about why progressive income tax is important. Back in 2004, sort of the final term of office of Peter Costello and John Howard, back in 2004, the top tax bracket, kicked in at $60,000. $60,000. Today it kicks in at $180,000. We trebled the threshold for the top tax bracket. We, on our behalf, Peter Costello, trebled the threshold for the top tax bracket. So back in the final term of the Howard government, 13% of Australians were in the top tax bracket. Today it's 3% are in the top tax bracket. Now, that not only flattens or reduces the progressivity of our tax system, it changes the way that people see themselves, and it changes the way that people see the income distribution. So I was watching the news last night, or the budget commentary last night, and people were talking with a straight face about middle income earners on $200,000 a year. Now, block your ears, children, but there's nothing fucking middle about earning $200,000 a year. There's nothing middle about it. It's more like 3 times the median wage. But because we now have a tax system where the top tax rate doesn't kick in until $180,000, we now have a whole bunch of people earning, good luck to them, $150,000, $160,000, $170,000 a year, twice median income, feeling like they're somehow in the middle. Now, Canberra's a high-income city. There's a lot of people in Canberra, by Australian standards, earn over $150,000 a year. But if you think for a minute that $200,000 a year are middle-income earners, then your perception of the income distribution has been fundamentally distorted by, in part, the way we've changed our tax system. So not only does reducing the progressivity of our tax system, such that now the government's very proud, they're saying everyone from $45,000 to $200,000 is going to be on the same tax rate. Well, that means it's not progressive. Right? Full stop. The fact that someone earning $250,000 a year pays a lot more tax than someone earning $40,000 a year doesn't make our system very progressive. And of course they do. When you earn 5 times more than someone, you'll probably pay a lot more tax than them. So it's not just the amount of tax, it's not just the income distribution. I think we've changed our society. We now, as a society, don't think that $200,000 a year is a lot of money. Well, it is. And to say that, for a politician to say that, has become a dangerous thing. It's absurd.
Matt, speaking of changing society, anytime I hear about climate change now, I kind of want to just go to bed and never come out. What was there in the budget for climate change?
Oh, the government and climate change. They have a difficult relationship in that they refuse to believe that the other exists. Look, the government had $3.5 billion for a fund over 15 years. And that was really the only climate change part of the budget. But climate change was there in other ways. In some great irony, which I'm not sure that the government really noticed, they were spending $3.5 billion over 15 years. They also set up a natural disaster relief fund.
I think it's a National Party relief fund.
To, basically combat the problem of climate change. They're putting $3.6 billion into it this year. So $3.5 billion to mitigate climate change over 15 years, and they're putting more than that in the first year into a fund to fight the issues around climate change that are appearing all the time. They're completely ineffective. It's not to say that $3.5 billion for programs to reduce emissions aren't a good idea, but it's a drop in
Doesn't
the
meet
ocean
the
for what's
scale of the
actually
problem.
needed. Yeah.
Eb, can I just add to that when it comes to the budget, we're told there's nothing more pressing. It's a moral issue for us to not burden future generations with financial debt. Yet the same people that say that are entirely apathetic, if not hostile, to the need to protect those same generations from climate change. So to simultaneously frame up public debt brackets, which they doubled, as a moral issue, that we owe it to future generations.
Intergenerational theft.
Oh, it's intergenerational theft. We have to be hard on the poor today, lest the poor in the future are even poorer. Yet at the same time, the same government is ignoring the intergenerational distributional consequences of ignoring climate change.
Now, the other thing I want to ask about before we throw to the Q&A with the audience, I can't help but notice we're on the eve of an election and we've had $300 billion odd in tax cuts. Does anyone on the panel think that might be enough to turn around the electoral fortunes of the coalition?
Well, can I say that this 300 billion tax cuts, if you ignore the economics behind it, and let's face it, only the Treasurer and Economist actually think the budget is about economics. It's if we strip all the economics out of it, we just look at it from a political point of view. All of the tax cuts don't come until after you guys submit your tax returns after the election. Now, this was announced a year ago. So a year ago, they knew that nobody was getting this tax cut until after the election. Now, for my mind, that is the dumbest political move you could possibly do. Nobody is feeling the benefit, no matter how small, of this tax cut until after the election. It seems crazy to me.
Look, I think that, the media, they love the theatre of the budget lockup, they love the theatre of budget night, and then for the last 5 years, everyone's got surprised that those 8-page wraparounds and all that wall-to-wall coverage hasn't ever actually driven the polls much at all. So you get all this analysis on budget night about what does it mean and who are they targeting and what is the strategy. And literally for 5 years, 2 weeks later, the first news poll, they're writing, well, we're surprised that it made bugger all difference. So
there's no budget bounce.
There's no budget bounce anymore. And that's because the budget has become so much about theatrics that people have become tired of these things that I think, unfortunately, people do tune out. And tuning out's not good. I'd love people to tune in, but we've got to get people to tune into the important bits. What are we spending more on? What are we spending less on? What kind of country are we trying to build? Budgets aren't about that. It's the accounting tricks and the cliches, and just doesn't seem to move the polls. So if history's anything to go by, I think this one won't move the polls either.
Troy, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with both of those points. Obviously, I think it's been a long time since we've seen any sort of budget bounce. I mean, maybe there was a negative bounce for the Abbott and hockey budget back in the day, but Richard's written and talked a lot about how the right's killed neoliberalism in Australia, and so to link to Matt's point, why not just give everyone $1,000 now, before the election?
Are you running for office?
I'm saying if I was.